So I want to set this question up. Most of the anti-Christian rhetoric, and I don't mean those who are against certain Christian values, but those who seek to disprove or debunk Christianity as a whole, there's usually there's a lot of revisionism in their thinking, right? For example, people may say things like Christianity obviously exists. That's undeniable. And so we know, right, air quotes, that the resurrection's false. We just know it. And so now we have to figure out a way to explain the empty tomb, the appearances, the church, the start of the early church, because we already know that there is no resurrection, right? They're starting from that.
We presume that nothing miraculous could ever happen. Yeah.
Right. And so now you made the point in the book, and I never thought about it this way, that the Jewish writers, they wouldn't have known enough about these other God tales or in order to even patch together some kind of fake copycat Messiah, tale. And I think that's really interesting because I think some people don't even challenge the assumption that even if Jesus was a copycat, the Jews or the Jewish writers didn't have enough background knowledge to be able to copy others. So can you elaborate on some of the similarities when you made this list of all the other gods and their criteria?
Yeah. So
even more so the vast differences between the data you collected. Yeah.
And part of what we're doing, and the great thing about a book like this is that, this is like a graphic novel. So Zondervan gave me 2 years to build the stage presentations, because I do a lot of conferences for this book, because I knew that if I could talk about this book in front of a jury, like if you could test run your closing argument in front of a jury 100 times, trust me, when you finally go to trial, you'll have a really convincing closing argument because you've seen what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, this is true when you write a book, and I did that with Cold Case. I had been talking about Cold Case, the stuff in Cold Case Christianity for years, visually, before I ever wrote the first book. But here now I'm going to write another book, and I hadn't had a chance to talk about this publicly in this robust way. So they gave me 2 years, and I built all these presentations, and I gave these presentations, and then I wrote a book from the presentations. The book then has all of the illustrations. 400 illustrations from the visual presentations are now in the book. So it's a kind of a graphic novel. So the great thing about it, we can talk about all the detail, but you really won't experience it until you see it, because it's like a graphic novel, right? Because every page, if you open it up, if there's not a list, there's an image. And
that's true.
So that's just the way it is. So that was my goal, was to make sure, like a kid's book, that you'd never open a page without an illustration.
Yeah.
So this is like a kid's book for adults. So the idea here is to trace the fuse that leads up to Jesus, because the fuse that leads up to a murder will show you how he's planning for that murder, how he really is moving things around to make sure he can get rid of her body and all that stuff. He gives them away. The fuse will give you away. Well, the fuse of history kind of gives away Jesus. And one of the things we talk about is that there's a spiritual fuse. Lots of people groups are examining they believe in lots of different mythologies, and the skeptics will say, yeah, Jesus is just another in the law. So let's get this right. If you look at the Jewish history in the Old Testament, tell me how typically God feels about the other gods. What is his admonition toward Jews related to their embracing of other deities? What is his admonition about even marrying or associating with people groups that embrace the other deities? It's always negative. Agreed? Yeah. So if you're suggesting that the first century authors of the Gospels, in trying to convince their fellow Jews that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, they're going to cobble together a story based on pagan mythologies. Really? Okay, so that's just what's happening here. Like they would not, I don't think so. But what's interesting is, and this is fair, is that you've got a number of ancient mythologies, hundreds and hundreds of them. And if you read through all of them, that's a big job. And I had 2 research assistants to help me do this. I was just looking, what's similar? What's similar between Attis and Osiris? What's similar between Heracles and Mithras? What's similar between all these guys, all these deities? And just to start, now it took several passes, because we would identify 5 really obvious similarities, and then you'd find this is similar. I saw this 3 times now, and you're like, go back and read it again. Just make sure we didn't miss it on all the other ones. And so we read through these mythologies over and over and over again, ending up with about 15 similarities.
Okay. Now
those 15 similarities could easily have been 18. We could have stretched it, but then you'd find that there'd be fewer of these similarities in each mythology. So you'll see that in the 15 we've identified, that these mythologies only have anywhere between 6 to 10 of them. So it's not like they all have these 15. Some have like the most you'll see is like 10 in any one mythology, and the least you'll see is about 6. But interestingly, these are if you look at them, they're very broad. So if you could say it's true that, for example, all the gods can perform miracles. Well, duh. I mean, if your God doesn't perform miracles, he's probably not a God. So I would expect that everyone could do that. Now, the kinds of miracles they perform are very different.
Yeah.
You could say that most, but not all, but most appear miraculously in some weird extra-natural way. But how they appear is very different. Most will grant eternal life or survive the grave in some way, but how they survive the grave is very different depending on story. So to argue that yeah, they're all rising and dying the same way, they're all coming into the world the same way through a virgin, that's just a lie. That's just not either not knowing or assuming or trying to draw parallels that are really stretching the facts. But it is interesting, don't you think, that there are these 15 similarities? But here's what if you list them and start to read through them, you realize, oh yeah, these are like the most obvious, expected, kind of common expectations that anyone who would think, if I said to you, hey, imagine that there's a God, and I don't have no experience. You've never read through Christianity. You have no experience with a world religion. But I want you to imagine there is a deity that has all power. Well, you would start to kind of like imagine certain characteristics of this deity. Yeah. And it turns out those are the common expectations of all deities. Even if you were to invent a new one today, you'd probably include some of these expectations.
Right.
Interestingly, one person shows up in history who embodies all 15 characteristics, even when no other deity embodies more than 10. And it's Jesus of Nazareth who has all 15.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that this is a pretty simple truth, that when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get a great result.
Yeah.
When you don't meet the expectations of the expector, you're like surprised and you don't move. I discovered this many times on the job. When I was working undercover, I looked like a bum. And whenever I would respond to a citizen as a police officer, they would say, "Give me a break." They wait for the uniformed officer because they expect that guy to be there, because their expectations of an officer are not. I wasn't meeting their expectations, and so I used to always have to get my badge out, and like I knew the first 2 minutes were going to be me convincing this guy I'm actually a police officer. You can tell me this because I'm working this case,
right?
But because I was not meeting their expectations. Well, if God wanted to enter into the world and meet the vast majority of expectations that people have about God, he would have to arrive at a time when these people are still worshiping their myths. And these things start to fall off the map in the Common Era. But there's a window, in which Jesus appears in the middle of that window, in which he appears at the time when most people are still worshiping the myths and have the common expectations that Jesus actually meets most robustly. These common expectations are not an evidence that Jesus was borrowed, but they're an evidence for the deity of Jesus, because they are the foundation upon which God enters into the world. If we all are created in the image of God, why would we be surprised that we would have common expectations about God? And that when God shows up, this is, by the way, clear to Paul. Paul was aware of the fact that these ancients were worshiping all kinds of mythologies on Mars Hill. He says, you people are super religious, man. You got a tomb for everybody here. You got a monument for everybody, even monuments for the unknown God. But I'm going to show you the real God. And here's what he says. I know that this Jesus guy is the real guy because unlike your mythologies, none of those stories claim to be eyewitness accounts. They're written from the minds of poets, as C.S. Lewis would say. And they don't even read like they were intended to be eyewitness accounts. Yet I'm here to share with you not what your poets think about God, but what we saw. And to have a mythology that comes from the mind of a poet is different than a claim about God that comes from the mouths of observers, of witnesses. And that is why he says the difference between Jesus and what you're worshiping is that we saw this with our own eyes. Yes. And that's the clear difference. And so Lewis puts it this way, that the myths, man's myths, are simply tales. Now, when he uses the word myth, he doesn't mean a falsehood. He means a narrative about deity. That's how he's using the word myth. He would say that man's myths come from the minds of ancient poets, whereas God's myth is Jesus grounded in what we call real things. And that's what Paul is saying on Mars Hill.
Wow.